So lead guitar DNA focuses primarily on the use of two-string arpeggios as a melodic soloing tool. So why is it important to know two-string arpeggios? First of all, they're great for exercise and practice. Just learning these shapes is going to make you a better lead guitar player. Two-string arpeggios are also used in a ton of solos that you already know. Master of Puppets, for example. Pretty melodic, right? The outro solo to Mr. Crowley. Another great reason to learn these shapes is they're going to help you break out of the pentatonic box, so to speak. Notice when you're playing these exercises that you're going to be traveling across the fretboard in a linear fashion as opposed to being stuck in one position. Lastly, and perhaps the most important thing, is that these two-string arpeggio shapes are going to be the perfect guide for understanding chord tone soloing. Chord tone soloing is basically understanding how the leads you're playing work over the chords you're playing over. Now there's a lot to go into there with theory, and you can kind of get deep into the weeds there with chord structure, and that's all important stuff. But for now, we're going to start out just by learning the shapes. Okay, so tab 1 in the files that comes with your program simply lays out the shapes for the two-string arpeggios for an A major chord. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate these for you on the 3rd and 4th strings, and we'll start with the root position shape. We'll then move on to the first inversion shape, and this is probably the toughest shape out of the 3 because you got a little bit of an extra stretch with your pinky. Looks like this. And then we have the second inversion shape, which looks like this. And then the whole cycle starts over again. You're back to the root position shape, only an octave higher. So this shape that we started on is now up here, an octave higher. Also, don't forget to practice these on the other string groupings that I tabbed out for you. I demonstrated them on strings 3 and 4, but I also tabbed out for you strings 1 and 2. And 5 and 6. Okay, now that we've learned the shapes, we're going to go ahead and practice them over a backing track. We're just going to work them in consecutive motion over backing track number 1, and it sounds like this. Okay, cool. So in exercise 2, one of the most critical things is something I call root recognition. And this is simply recognizing of the three notes that you're playing in the shape, which one is the root. This is going to be critical so you know what chord you're playing. In the example, we're playing an A chord, so we're going to want to know which one of those notes in the shape is the A. So what I did in the exercise was had you land for an extended period of time on the A note in each shape so that you could recognize and memorize that note. So for example, when you're in the root position shape, you play and land on the root with your middle finger. For the first inversion shape, we land on the root with our pinky. And then for the second inversion shape, we land on the root with our index finger on the third string. Take the time to memorize which finger it is that you're using to play the root so that when you start to shift these shapes, you'll know what chord it is that you're playing. Okay, so for exercise 3, we're going to start connecting the shapes. This is going to really help to give us a nice out-of-the-box, wide feel to our playing. So what we're going to do is, instead of staying in the same position and repeating the shape, we are now going to ascend one shape, shift to the next, and descend. So for example, root position slides up to first inversion. First inversion slides up to second inversion. So we're going to play this exercise over backing track 1, Start My Motor Breath, and it sounds like this. So something important to notice at the end of exercise 3 is that I finish on a bend. In this case, I bend to the root A. So these two-string arpeggio shapes are going to be a great roadmap for bending to chord tones. Throughout the program, I'm going to be throwing in some whole step and some half step bends to spice things up a little bit, but also to show you how bending can fit within the shapes. Okay, let's move on to exercise 4. So in exercise 4, we're going to practice the shapes over 3 octaves, and we're going to kind of move in a diagonal motion, and we're going to do this by starting on the 6th string. So for example, if I'm using the root position shape, 6th string, move it to the 4th string an octave higher, and then move it to the 2nd string another octave higher. So notice at the end of exercise 4, I connect the root position shape with the first inversion shape by sliding from 12 up to 17, which has a really cool slinky sound to it. So this diagonal approach and connecting the shapes really gives you a good sound of spanning across the fretboard and breaking out of the box. So exercise 5 used all of the techniques we introduced in section 1. We started out with some diagonal approach. We then connected some arpeggios in consecutive motion. We also did some bending to chord tones. We also introduced one more technique at the very end, and that's some sweep picking. Sweep picking is really a technique that allows you to get through notes faster than if you were to attempt to alternate your pick through them. So I've included a bonus exercise that dives deeper into sweep picking technique using 2-string arpeggios. So when you're feeling ready, take a look at the bonus section included in your program. As we close out section 1, I would like to take just a brief moment and talk about triads. So what is a triad? Well, all the simple chords you typically start learning on the guitar, like a C, a G, a D, these are all examples of triads because they only have 3 different notes in them. All the arpeggio shapes we were just learning are example of melodic versions of those triads. Notice they all have only 3 different notes. Now theoretically, a triad is a 3-note chord consisting of a root, a third, and a fifth. The root of the chord is also what we name our chords. So if we're playing an A chord, A is the root. And then we stack a third and a fifth on top of that. Now in the files that come with your program, I've included one called Triad Structures. This is going to be a great reference for you to understand how triads are actually put together. The 2-string arpeggio shapes are going to be a great way for you to get triads under your fingers so you can play them in a melodic fashion. Okay, enough of that stuff. Let's move on to section 2. In section 1, we focused primarily on a single chord, the A chord, so that we could learn the shapes. Now in section 2, we're going to start adding some additional chords into the mix. The next 2 exercises, we're going to add in the G chord. This is going to allow us to start understanding how we can connect one chord to the next. In fact, exercise 6 is called Connecting Chords, and it's performed over backing track 3. Okay, a couple of important points regarding exercise 6. First off, there's some more chord tone bending. So let's take a look at that to start with. We start with the root position shape that slides up and connects to the first inversion shape. And then we bend to the root. So we have a whole step bend. Then when we do the same exact thing with the G arpeggio, we're going to have a half step bend at the top. So you're bending to the root of each chord, but for the first chord by whole step, the second chord by half step. The last thing I want to point out about exercise 6 is during the second half we just have lots of repetition of the arpeggio shapes, which is a good thing. It's really good practice, first of all, for getting good at the shapes, and it shows you how these chords can connect from one to the next. Specifically, I want to point out how we start to use different inversions in combination to create a different feeling from the voicings of the chords. So for example, we start out on the A root position shape, and then we just move that shape to the G chord. So it's like a parallel motion of shapes. We return to the A chord. We're going to go back to the G chord, but this time I use the first inversion G. Which gives you a feeling of wanting to climb to the first inversion A. Leading you to the second inversion G. Climbing you all the way up to the second inversion A. Exercise 7 is performed over backing track 4, which has a bit of a Van Halen vibe to it. It also is similar to exercise 6 in that it's in two parts. The first part is kind of a melodic, slinky part that has some chord tone bending, and the second half is based on a melodic pattern that's played throughout the arpeggios. But something else I want to point out is that when I close that exercise out, I throw in this bluesy riff. This was thrown in intentionally because I want you to start to see how you can combine other elements of your playing along with these two-string shapes. You can use pentatonics, you can use blues riffs and bendy ideas that you can combine with these to come up with cooler, more expressive riffs. Okay, let's talk a little bit about common tones. What is a common tone? Well, common tones are notes that are shared between two different chords. So in the last couple exercises, we were playing an A and a G chord. And when you compare those chords side by side, they have no notes in common. A is spelled A, C sharp, and E. G is spelled G, B, and D. So there's no notes in common. In fact, if you kind of smush those two chords together, you would basically have an A mixolydian scale without the F sharp. Now we're going to add a D chord into the mix. So let's compare the D with the A and the G. So when you compare the D chord, which is spelled D, F sharp, and A, with the A chord, A, C sharp, and E, you notice you have a common tone between those two chords, the A. Let's demonstrate this. We're going to look at the common tone relationship between A and D by comparing the A root position shape with the D second inversion shape. And you'll notice when you compare those two that the A in the bass remains the same for both chords. The same goes for the G and the D chord. If I take the D arpeggio in root position and the G arpeggio in second inversion, you'll notice that that D note stays in the bass both times. This creates a strong melodic connection between these chords. Okay, let's move on to exercise 8, which is going to demonstrate the common tone relationship between the A and the D chord. So moving along, exercise 9 is going to review the common tones from the A to the D chord, which is a dominant relationship. D and A are a fifth apart. And it's going to review the common tone relationships of the D to the G chord, which is also in the opposite direction, a fifth apart. So they both have dominant relationships. One more thing I'll say about exercise 9 is it also introduces a pivoting technique, which basically is where you're going to be alternating one note against other notes in succession. So you have this, for example, on the first arpeggio shape, the A note is going to continue to repeat against the other note. Really cool effect, very common in kind of like a neoclassical guitar type of feel. Exercise 10 focuses on the chords we've been working on, the relationships of A to D and D to G. It's also going to add in one more chord, the E chord, which, you guessed it, has a dominant relationship to the A chord. Those are a fifth apart from one another. So that's a wrap for section 2. In this section, we moved the two-string arpeggio shapes from one chord to the next, so we used multiple chords. We talked about common tone relationships as well as dominant relationships. Okay, let's move on to section 3. So far, we've only used major triads throughout this program. Now, we're going to introduce some minor triads into the mix. So before we move forward, I just want to take a moment and discuss the words major and minor. What do they mean? The words major and minor refer to the quality of a chord or a triad or a key. Now, the theory side of that goes back to the intervallic structure of those triads. But what does our ear tell us? Well, major typically sounds a little bit brighter and happier. Minor, a little darker, maybe sadder or more mysterious. See how serious I got there? Exercise 11 is going to review the two-string arpeggio shapes in minor. I'm going to demonstrate them on the 3rd and 4th string like I did with the majors. And like with the majors, I have also tabbed them out on the 1st and 2nd string and the 5th and 6th string. So as I demonstrate these, I'm going to start out actually by playing the major that we've already learned, and then I'll show you how we turn that into the minor shape. So let's start out with root position, A major. All we're going to do to make this minor is lower our index finger note by half step, or lower the third by half step. Now let's go to first inversion. So first inversion major, and this is the shape again where you got a little bit of a stretch. All we need to do to make this shape minor is take the third and lower it by half step, and that's going to be the note that you play with your middle finger. And I feel like this actually makes the shape even a little bit harder when you have to turn it into minor, because your index and middle are kind of close together, and then your pinky has to kind of jaunt out there. So, but nonetheless. And then we have our second inversion shape, where we played major. Where we just lower our pinky note by half step. In exercise 12, we're going to learn how to walk the minor shapes, kind of like we learned how to walk the major shapes in section 1. Only difference this time is we're going to take all those techniques that we learned in section 1 and roll it into one exercise. So exercise 12 is going to use the minor shapes and going to have some diagonal motion. We're going to connect the shapes and we're going to use some chord tone bending. So here we go, exercise 12. In exercise 13, we are going to connect the A minor arpeggio with the F major arpeggio. So here once again, if we do a quick comparison, A minor is spelled A, C, and E. F major is spelled F, A, and C. So we have two common tones between these two chords, the A and the C, so it's going to have a very strong melodic connection. So let's look at this a little closer. A minor is related to F major by the distance of a third, A, G, F. So therefore they have what we call a mediant relationship. Any chord related by a third is going to be a mediant. Mediant relationships typically share two notes in common. So as we said, the A minor and the F major share the notes A and C, strong melodic connection. So let's demonstrate this. Root position, A minor shape. First inversion, F major shape. All we have to do is move that fifth of the A minor chord up a half step to the roots of the F chord. The final section of our program is going to combine all the techniques that we've learned throughout the first three sections. The only difference is we're actually going to change keys. So far we've been exclusively in the key of A, and this is great because A is a very common guitar key, but of course these shapes are mobile, so we can move them into any key we want. Let's move on to exercise 14, which is going to be in the key of D minor. Okay, the final exercise of the program, exercise 15. It's performed over backing track 10, and it's in B minor. So sweep picking is a technique that allows us to play things much faster that we would not normally be able to play if we were using an alternate picking technique. So to dive a little bit deeper into sweep picking, what you're doing is you're creating energy by using the resistance of the string against your pick. So let's test this out. So if you were just to take, for example, the bonus exercise, the first note is the 7th fret on the D string. If you hold that note and just take your pick and pressure it against the string without playing it, so you can feel that there's like an energy building up there that's going to carry you through to the next string. So as you force your way through the resistance of the 4th string, you'll land on the 3rd string, which will also have that same feeling of energy and resistance. And once you get through the 3rd string, you will then be in position for the up pick to start the descent of the arpeggio.